They called him Son of Sam.
But behind the headline was David Berkowitz, a man, a boy, a broken mirror of someone who might have just been ordinary. I still remember the first time I read the crime reports. It wasn't the numbers that chilled me, it was the silence between them. 6 people dead, 7 more wounded. A series of shootings that held New York City hostage from July 1976 to August 1977. He used a .44 caliber revolver, striking at night. The victims, often young couples sitting in parked cars. Strangers to him, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it wasn't just the murders. It was the fear, the paralyzing uncertainty. He taunted the police with letters rambling eerie signed as Son of Sam. Newspapers printed them. People locked their doors earlier. Women dyed their hair blonde to avoid matching victim profiles. The entire city flinched at shadows. That's what fascinated me. How could one man so seemingly invisible in his daily life become a symbol of terror?
I don't ask what he did, we know that. I ask how he became someone who could.
Because monsters aren't born, they're made. In his story, there's no blood in my telling, only silence, rejection, and a slow descent. A descent that I believe began long before the first shot was fired, long before he was Son of Sam. It began in a small bedroom, a boy, a quiet night, and the sound of a whisper no one else could hear. That's where we begin. It's easy to imagine monsters crawling out of alleyways. What's harder is accepting that some are born in quiet homes, wrapped in soft blankets with lullabies in the air.
David Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco in 1953 in Brooklyn, but he wouldn't keep that name for long. His mother gave him up for adoption not long after he was born. She said it was for his own good.
The Berkowitz family took him in Nathan and Pearl. They were stable working class, by most accounts, decent people. And yet, from the very beginning, something didn't settle in David. Something didn't root. Adoption can be a second chance. But for some children, it feels like a question mark stamped onto their soul. Why didn't they want me? Who am I really? For David, that question lingered like a shadow in his bedroom. Silent, heavy. His adoptive mother, Pearl, was the emotional core of the household. He clung to her. She made him feel safe, even if only temporarily. But then when he was just a teenager, cancer took her. No warning, no time to prepare.
And something inside David split.
That kind of loss, it does more than hurt. It confirms a fear. That love always leaves. That the world is cold. That attachments are dangerous. From then on, David became different. Not violent, not yet, but withdrawn. Angry. Easily slighted, always watching. And that whisper I mentioned earlier, that silent flicker of something wrong,
it grew louder, not in words, but in feelings, in stares, in the way he stopped playing outside, in the way he stared at other children laughing as though he didn't belong.
Maybe because deep down he believed he didn't.
School should be a place of belonging, a place where children learn who they are by how others see them. But for David, school was a mirror that never showed him the same reflection twice.
Teachers noticed him, but not in the way a child hopes to be seen. He was distracted, impulsive, isolated. His grades fell behind early. Not because he couldn't learn, but because he couldn't focus. Something inside him seemed distant, like his body was in the room, but his mind was somewhere else. And the other children. They sensed that difference. Children have a way of noticing the odd one, the quiet one, the boy who stares too long or laughs too late. David was often the target of teasing, not cruel, but enough. Enough to remind him daily that he didn't quite fit. He didn't make real friends, not lasting ones. He was too intense, too reactive. One wrong word, and he'd explode or retreat into silence. A teacher once described him as moody. Another said he had a strange energy. By the time he reached middle school, that strange energy began turning into hostility. He became obsessed with power, with control. He would argue with classmates, lash out when he felt slighted. But afterward, he would look blank, like it hadn't even happened. What haunts me is this. Who noticed? Who looked past the disruption and asked what it meant? Probably no one. because his behavior wasn't bad enough to alarm, just odd enough to isolate. It's in this stage that the whisper inside David turned into a murmur, a constant hum of resentment, rejection, and confusion, a soundtrack only he could hear. Puberty changes everyone, but for some it opens a door that should have stayed closed. David entered adolescence like a boy walking into fog, already unsure of himself, now flooded with urges, questions, impulses. But instead of reaching out for help, he went deeper inward. He became obsessed with fire. He admitted years later to starting hundreds of small fires around New York. Not for destruction, at least not at first. It was for the thrill, the illusion of power. He even kept a journal, a diary of arson. That alone tells you something. Fire gave him focus, purpose, something to control in a life that felt chaotic and abandoned. Then there were the fantasies, dark ones.
He started imagining violence. Not just flashes, but full stories, scenes where he had the power and others didn't. He once said that during these years, he began hearing voices. At first, he thought they were his thoughts. Then he believed they came from outside him.
Some critics say the voices were a fabrication and excuse, but I don't think it matters. What matters is that he believed them. And once you believe a voice that justifies your darkness, it becomes harder to resist it.
Socially, he kept unraveling. Girls avoided him, he didn't know how to talk to them. Boys challenged him, he backed down or erupted. He was both ashamed and angry, embarrassed by his awkwardness, furious at being rejected.
The mind begins to fragment in moments like this, not all at once. Quietly. A crack here. A shift there. David didn't look like a threat. He just looked odd. A loner. Someone you'd pass on the street and forget, but inside the whisper had become a voice, and the voice had started speaking clearly. You learn early in life if you can't fit in, pretend. David did just that.
He graduated high school barely. His father remarried and moved to Florida, leaving David feeling more abandoned than ever. But still he tried to do the normal things. He joined the army, served 3 years. People said he was a quiet soldier, disciplined, never a problem.
But the mask was already in place by then. Underneath the fire still burned. The voices still whispered. But on the outside he was just another face. Unremarkable. It's one of the most dangerous forms of deviance, the kind that hides in plain sight. After the army, he returned to New York, took odd jobs, lived alone. Nobody really knew him. His neighbors said he seemed polite, though a bit strange. Always kept to himself. That phrase again. He even tried to reconnect with his birth mother. When he found her, the reunion wasn't what he hoped. She told him the truth. He had been an unwanted pregnancy. His father had been married to another woman. David wasn't just given away, he was a secret. Imagine hearing that from the only person who could have answered your oldest question. Why didn't you keep me? And the answer was shame. That visit shattered him, but he didn't show it, not to the world. He smiled when necessary, worked when required, and all the while the whisper had become something else entirely. Not just a voice now, but a presence. A shadow that walked beside him. When you build a mask strong enough, it can fool everyone, even yourself.
But masks crack. And when David's did, the world would hear it.
The mind can hold a lot of pain quietly, endlessly, until something tips it over. For David Berkowitz, that final fracture didn't come with screams or sirens. It came through isolation, repetition, a growing sense that he was invisible. When he returned from the army, David tried to reintegrate, but nothing stuck. His jobs didn't last. His relationships never formed. Days blurred into each other, wake up, walk, sleep, repeat. He began gaining weight, sleeping less, growing more paranoid. Then came the dogs. He claimed later that his neighbor's black Labrador was possessed, that the dog was channeling a demon named Sam, commanding David to kill. But this wasn't sudden. His obsession with demons and voices had been quietly forming over the years. The idea of evil gave structure to his chaos.
Whether it was psychosis or fantasy or both doesn't change the outcome. David believed the world was speaking to him through symbols, through whispers in the dark. He began writing letters to himself. Strange apocalyptic phrases. Obey, destroy, cleanse. He felt chosen.
And this is the moment where choice and compulsion blur. Was it mental illness or an escape from accountability? That's the eternal debate. But here's what we know: David bought a .44 caliber revolver, not in a frenzy, not as a reaction, calmly, deliberately, like someone following instructions written in his mind. He stalked the streets at night alone, studying parked cars, looking for young women, his targets, his unfinished sentences. And then he acted. In July 1976, the first shot rang out. A young woman and her friend attacked in their car. One killed, one wounded. The city didn't know it yet, but something had arrived.
Not loud, not fast.
Just inevitable. There's something chilling about quiet violence, when it's not rage, not chaos, but something colder. David didn't scream. He didn't tremble. He walked toward the cars with the calm of someone posting a letter. And that's what makes it terrifying, because in that moment he felt peace.
Later, when asked, he said it felt like a release, like pressure leaving his body, like doing what he was born to do. He talked about the voices urging him on, about Sam the demon he believed lived inside his neighbor's dog. He said Sam needed blood to stay quiet.
But deep down, what did David really feel? I believe it was power. For the first time in his life, he was not invisible. His hand decided life or death. His choices mattered. He had the final word. In his world of silence, that meant something.
He didn't stop after the first murder, or the second, or the third. He changed burrows, varied his tactics slightly, but the method stayed the same. Walk up to a car, pull the trigger, vanish.
No personal connection to the victims, no clear motive, just an urge, a ritual. And every time the city shivered a little more. Newspapers gave him a name. The public turned him into a phantom. And David, he watched it all unfold. Listened to the radio reports, read the headlines, kept the clippings.
In his mind, the whisper had become applause.
It wasn't just murder, it was performance. And the whole city had taken a seat in his theater. But in the shadows behind that performance, I believe part of him was still the boy. Still lost. Still waiting for someone to stop him.
And no one did. You might expect remorse, regret, or at least fear.
But after each murder, David Berkowitz didn't hide in panic. He returned to his apartment, sat alone, ate frozen dinners, sometimes watched TV.
Then he wrote letters taunting the police, mocking the press, long rambling messages filled with strange symbols and bizarre phrases. I am a monster. I live for the hunt. He signed them as Son of Sam, creating a new identity larger than life, beyond consequence.
But the truth, he was spiraling. The line between fantasy and reality had dissolved. He believed he was part of a supernatural war, that he was an instrument, a soldier in a dark army no one else could see. This wasn't growth, it was decay. He wasn't evolving. He was rotting from within. His routines became more obsessive. He started pacing his apartment for hours, hearing whispers, seeing shadows that weren't there. But still he went to work, still nodded at neighbors, still walked the same streets. No one suspected a thing, until he slipped. He left a parking ticket near a crime scene. One detail, one mistake. And with that, the mask began to crumble. But what haunts me isn't the capture. It's what happened before, the in-between days. When he walked the city like a ghost, when he looked in the mirror and saw something divine or demonic staring back, when no one questioned the man alone in his apartment, listening to voices. It's easy to say he was evil, but that's a shortcut. What I saw in the records in his writings was not just evil. It was erosion. A person sinking deeper each day. No rope, no anchor.
And no one reaching in.
August 10th, 1977, the mask shattered. Police surrounded David Berkowitz's car outside his Yonkers apartment. Inside, they found the .44 caliber revolver, a duffel bag, and maps with scrawled notes. It wasn't a dramatic arrest. No chase, no violence, just a man stepping out of the shadows and almost sighing in relief. "You got me," he said. "What took you so long? I've studied hundreds of confessions, but that line, it stuck with me. It wasn't taunting. It sounded tired, as if part of him had been waiting not to get away but to be stopped. At the station, he spoke openly. Too openly, about demons, about voices, about Sam. Some thought it was a performance and insanity plea in the making, but I believe it was more than strategy. It was his reality, twisted, warped, but real to him.
He was declared competent to stand trial. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no drawn-out process. He pled guilty to all charges, 6 murders, multiple attempted murders. And just like that, son of Sam was sentenced to 365 years in prison.
But the real sentence that came later, alone in a cell. No voices to distract him, no headlines, just David and a mirror. He's spoken since then about being born again, about faith, about regret. Some believe him, others don't. But when I look at his eyes in those interviews, I don't see madness. I don't see a monster. I see a man who remembers everything.
And lives with it.
Because that's the final punishment, not death, not a cage, but being left alone with the truth of what you've done. Sometimes people ask me, could we have stopped him? It's the hardest question to answer. Because when you trace the path of David Berkowitz, you don't find a moment of transformation. You find erosion, a slow fading of self, a boy unloved, a teenager unseen, a man unheard. Not everyone who feels alone becomes a killer. Not every child who loses a parent ends up listening to voices. But when trauma goes unanswered and pain turns inward long enough, something breaks. We want to believe evil is easy to spot. Sharp teeth, wild eyes, a dark coat in a crowd. But David didn't look like that. He looked tired, quiet, forgettable. And that's why it matters. Because there are other boys right now, silent, staring out windows, feeling unwanted. Some burn inside. Some fantasize about power, about control, about being heard, no matter how. It's not our job to excuse what David did. He chose, he acted, and lives were lost, irrevocably.
But if we don't ask why, we learn nothing. Maybe the warning isn't about monsters at all. Maybe it's about moments.
Moments when a child is grieving and no one listens. Moments when the strange kid is laughed at instead of spoken to. Moments when the whisper first begins and someone could have said, I see you. Because that whisper, faint, almost nothing, is where it all begins. And if someone had reached through that flickering silence, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't have ended in blood.